Hi, Rushrecap here. Today I am going to explain a movie called Boot Camp. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Since the rise of tough love rehabilitation programs in the 1970s, over 200 facilities have popped up worldwide, taking in thousands of troubled young people. These centers operate without any government oversight, and while over 40 deaths have been officially reported, countless more lives have been forever changed, many for the worse. One night, Danny was suddenly woken up by two men storming into his bedroom. Before he could understand what was happening, they handcuffed him and dragged him out of his room. Outside, his parents were waiting, but instead of helping him, they stood by as the men told Danny it was for his own good. He pleaded for his parents to intervene, but they remained firm, convinced they were doing what was best for him. The following day, Sophie was at a store, trying to return a product she had just bought. It had a small scratch, but instead of calmly addressing the issue, she lost her temper, tossing things around and causing a scene. Just as the situation was escalating, Ben, her boyfriend, stepped in. At first, it looked like he was going to scold her for her behavior, but instead, he leaned in and kissed her. Sophie laughed. It had all been a prank she was pulling on Ben, her way of having fun at his expense. Meanwhile, Jack was at a club, having the time of his life. He was high, walking across the beams on the ceiling, completely carefree. But the good times came to a halt when he realized he was bleeding. Later that day, Sophie returned home only to find her mother, Marianne, and stepfather, Carl, hosting an important dinner with some prominent guests. Sophie, unfazed by the formal gathering, crashed the dinner, loudly declaring that all politicians were corrupt as she pulled out a joint. Carl had been searching her room and discovered the joint, but when Sophie tried to protest, Marianne quickly pulled her aside to avoid further embarrassment. Carl, however, made it clear that Sophie was out of chances. That evening, Sophie and Ben attended a party. Ignoring the signs warning them not to enter a restricted area, they snuck upstairs, where they smoked and kissed, lost in their own world. In the heat of the moment, Sophie jokingly proposed to Ben, saying they should get married so she could escape her parents. Ben laughed it off, blaming it on the weed. After all, they were still underage, not even 18 yet. Suddenly, the door burst open, and several men barged into the room. They announced that they had Sophie's parents' permission to take her away. Ben tried to intervene but was quickly overpowered and tied up in a different room. Sophie, on the other hand, fought back with everything she had, but it was no use. The men injected her with a sedative, and within moments, she was unconscious. When Ben finally made his way to Sophie's house to demand answers, Carl coldly informed him that Sophie was being kept somewhere safe, far away, for an entire year. Marianne tried to justify their decision, claiming that Sophie's behavior was tearing the family apart. Carl, growing increasingly agitated, threatened to call the police if Ben didn't leave immediately. The next morning, Sophie woke up on a boat, confused and disoriented. She wasn't alone. Danny and Jack were with her, the latter hunched over the side of the boat, vomiting into the ocean. Sophie demanded answers, but the men escorting them refused to say anything. It was Danny who finally told her the truth. They were being taken to a place in Fiji. Eventually, the boat reached a secluded island, and the three teens were forced to march through the dense forest until they arrived at a behavioral rehabilitation boot camp. Logan, the chief of security, greeted them, flanked by his team of coordinators. The first thing they did was attach ankle sensors to each of the teens. Logan explained that the sensors would alert security if anyone tried to leave the camp's perimeter. Not that it mattered, there was no way to swim to freedom, given the island's remote location and the shark-infested waters surrounding it. Their personal belongings were confiscated, and they were led to the shore, where they were chained to concrete blocks. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, the temperature dropped. Waves crashed against the shore, freezing the teens as they huddled together for warmth. The cold, relentless water soaked their clothes, and the three held hands, supporting one another through the miserable ordeal. The next morning, Logan and his team returned to unchain them. Arthur, the camp's founder and director, gave them a short speech, full of the usual motivational platitudes. When Jack made a snide remark, Arthur calmly informed him that foul language wasn't tolerated before deliberately stepping on Jack's foot with his cane. He went on to explain that the concrete blocks were symbolic, a way of punishing the teens for the way they had weighed down their parents with their troublesome behavior. As they were led into the heart of the camp, Sophie and Danny saw the other campers hard at work. One of the coordinators gave them a tour, explaining how things worked around there. Every new camper started out as a black shirt, but through good behavior, they could eventually earn a yellow shirt and later, a white one. White shirts were allowed to go home after completing their rehabilitation. The goal, they were told, was to make it to a white shirt. As part of the initiation process, Jack had his hair forcibly shaved. Sophie was given a uniform by Trina, a veteran camper. Then, Arthur's sister Rhonda subjected Sophie to an invasive body search, making sure she wasn't hiding anything illicit. Back home, Ben was still reeling from Sophie's sudden disappearance. Desperate for answers, he met with Marianne again, begging her to tell him where Sophie had been taken. Marianne, guilt-ridden, confessed that Sophie had been sent to the Serenity boot camp in the South Pacific. Despite her conflicted feelings, she still believed it was for Sophie's own good. While Ben began researching everything he could about the camp, Sophie was adjusting to her new life. Days were long and grueling, filled with non-stop work and study. The meals were meager, and the nights were even worse. Cold showers, dirt floors, and insects crawling around her feet. The white shirts didn't have to participate in the manual labor. Instead, they enjoyed better meals and spent their time monitoring the other campers, making sure nothing was stolen or damaged. Whenever someone acted out, they were thrown into the pit cells. These were deep holes in the ground, barely big enough to stand in, and the teens were left there for hours as punishment. One day, the campers gathered in a large tent for a group session. Trina was put in the middle of the circle with a small microphone attached to her shirt. Arthur instructed everyone to clap in support of her before asking why she was there. When Trina claimed she didn't know, a few teens were chosen to surround her, and they began pushing her around, accusing her of various transgressions. They listed everything she'd done wrong, from buying drugs to sleeping with multiple boys. As the verbal assault continued, Trina finally broke down. Tearfully, she admitted that her parents had suffocated her with their strict religious rules, and she had acted out in defiance. She revealed that she had made a bet with her friends to see who could sleep with the most boys in one night. She had slept with 8, hoping that at least one of them would see her for who she really was, unlike her parents. Eventually, she collapsed to her knees, sobbing and apologizing. The other teens circled around her, telling her they loved her, but Sophie wasn't convinced. Later that night, Sophie overheard Trina praying quietly to herself. Sophie couldn't help but feel unsettled after witnessing Trina's breakdown during the group session. The forced confessions, the orchestrated circle of verbal abuse, and the eerie cult-like atmosphere gnawed at her, making her question the authenticity of it all. As Trina muttered a prayer, Sophie lay on her thin, ragged blanket, staring up at the moonlit sky through the cracks in the cabin's roof. Something was wrong with this place. It wasn't just the tough conditions, it was the way they broke people down, slowly eroding their sense of self. The next few weeks were grueling. Sophie, Danny, and Jack fell into a monotonous rhythm of work, obedience, and fear. Each day, they were pushed harder, punished more severely for even the smallest infractions. Jack's rebellious nature made him an easy target for the camp's enforcers. One day, after a particularly harsh punishment, Sophie found him in the corner of the camp, nursing his wounds. "They're never going to let us out of here, you know," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. He had stopped trying to fight back. Sophie wanted to offer words of encouragement, but deep down, she feared he was right. Danny, on the other hand, seemed more resigned to his fate. "If we just follow the rules, maybe we can get out sooner," he said one night, his voice trembling with exhaustion and desperation. But even as he said it, there was a hollowness in his tone that suggested he no longer believed in that hope. As the days wore on, Sophie found herself becoming more and more detached from reality. The boot camp operated on a system of psychological manipulation, breaking down the campers' spirits to the point where escape seemed impossible, not just physically but mentally. The island's isolation, the constant surveillance, and the intense fear of punishment kept everyone in line. Sophie often found herself staring out at the horizon, the endless ocean serving as a reminder of just how trapped they were. Then, one fateful night, Sophie overheard a conversation between Logan and Arthur. They were discussing the success rate of the camp and the lucrative business it had become. The words chilled her to the bone. This wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about control and profit. These teens weren't here to be helped. They were being exploited, their families paying exorbitant amounts of money to fix them, unaware of the true horrors taking place on the island. Determined to do something, Sophie began to plot an escape. She couldn't do it alone though, and knew she would need allies. She approached Danny and Jack with the idea, and though hesitant, both eventually agreed. Jack was the most skeptical. "You really think we can outsmart these guys? They've got ankle monitors on us, and we're in the middle of the ocean." But despite his doubt, the fire of rebellion in him was rekindled, if only faintly. The plan was risky. They needed to find a way to disable the ankle sensors and steal one of the boats without being caught. The hardest part, however, was keeping up the facade of obedience while secretly preparing for their escape. Sophie knew that if they were caught, the punishment would be severe, likely in the pit cells or worse. As they quietly observed the camp's routines, they realized there was a pattern to the guards' shifts. During the early hours of the morning, security was at its weakest. Logan often disappeared for hours, leaving the other enforcers to slack off. This would be their window of opportunity. Weeks of careful planning culminated in one final, desperate attempt to flee the island. The night before the escape, Sophie could barely sleep. Her heart raced with anxiety, but also with hope. If they could pull this off, they would finally be free. The thought of seeing her family again, of confronting her parents and showing them what they had done, fueled her determination. As dawn approached, Sophie, Danny, and Jack made their move. They had fashioned makeshift tools to disable the ankle monitors, and under the cover of darkness, they snuck past the sleeping guards. The boat was anchored on the far side of the island, just beyond the camp's boundaries. It took all of Sophie's willpower to stay calm as they crept through the forest, the sound of their footsteps barely audible over the crashing waves. But just as they reached the boat, a loud alarm pierced the silence. The ankle monitors had triggered a signal, alerting Logan and the rest of the enforcers. Panic set in as the teens scrambled to get the boat untied. Logan's voice boomed through the darkness, ordering them to stop. "You can't run from this, Sophie," he shouted, his footsteps closing in fast. With adrenaline coursing through their veins, the three teens managed to start the boat just as Logan and his team burst onto the shore. As they sped away from the island, the cold ocean spray hitting their faces, Sophie looked back one last time. The camp, the island, the place that had almost broken her, it was all disappearing into the distance. But their journey was far from over. The open sea presented a whole new set of dangers. As they drifted further from the island, uncertainty set in. Where would they go? Would they make it to safety, or would the ocean claim them before they could reach the mainland? Sophie stared out into the horizon, the weight of the unknown heavy on her shoulders. They were free for now, but freedom came with its own set of challenges. As Sophie, Danny, and Jack drifted further into the vast expanse of the ocean, the weight of their escape began to settle in. They had defied the odds, outwitted their captors, and broken free from the island that had sought to crush their spirits. But as the waves crashed around them and the darkness of the night stretched endlessly ahead, they realized their journey had only just begun. The open sea was unforgiving, and the horizon held no promise of safety. Yet, for the first time in months, Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. They were no longer prisoners of the boot camp, no longer subject to its twisted rules and relentless punishments. They were free, free to fight for their lives, free to reclaim their identities, and free to tell the world the truth about the horrors they had endured. As dawn began to break, casting a soft glow over the water, Sophie turned to her companions. Danny, though exhausted, offered a weak smile. Jack, his rebellious spirit reignited, nodded in quiet resolve. They had made it this far together, and they would continue fighting together. The horizon ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to conquer. Sophie, with her eyes fixed on the rising sun, knew one thing for sure: they had survived the island, and whatever challenges awaited them next, they would face them head-on. Their story wasn't over, it was only just beginning. In the face of unimaginable odds, Sophie, Danny, and Jack found a way to break free, not just from the island, but from the fear that had kept them captive for so long. Their escape serves as a reminder that no matter how hopeless things may seem, courage and determination can light the way forward. But as they move into the unknown, the real test of their resilience has only just begun. Will they survive the dangers ahead? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this recap and want more thrilling stories like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Rushrecap. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next recap.